Hi, I'm Professor Jess LeVine. I'm here this afternoon with Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and best-selling author Tony Horwitz to talk about his works and his latest book, Midnight Rising, about John Brown and the famous raid, and to find out what the book's about and how it all came together. Hi, Tony. Nice to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
I have a lot of questions for you about the book itself and also about how you go about writing in general. And but I wanted to ask you a question I kind of noticed right away about your inspiration. And when you see somebody say that inspiration came from their parents, it's usually kind of revealing. So, you know, you said your father gave you the passion and your mother gave you the paint. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that was the dedication for Confederates in the Attic, a book about the Civil War and Civil War memory. And the passion referred to my father, who really gave me my interest in the Civil War. He and a relative on the other side, on my mother's side. I was the youngest of 3 children and the only one who shared my father's interest in the Civil War. So we used to read books together and he would take me to battlefields. So he really gave me that passion for the subject. And my mother was an artist and a writer, and she literally gave me the paint. When we moved to a new house when I was 7, she gave me these paints and told me to paint the walls of the attic, which was going to become my bedroom, and I covered it with Civil War scenes. So, and she also taught me a lot about writing. So that's what that dedication referred to.
How early did you kind of feel that coming from her, the writing kind of bug or the... Yeah.
I was kind of blockheaded because, in retrospect, it makes sense I became a writer. She wrote children's books and was a freelance journalist. And again, since I was the youngest, by the time I came along, she wanted to go back to work. And I would just kind of tag along with her and spent a lot of time watching her do what she did. But it really wasn't until years later that I got interested in writing. Never worked for my high school paper or college paper. Really my mid-20s, and then, you know, I kind of looked back and thought, well, of course, but no, it wasn't conscious at the time.
Parents have a way of planting seeds, I think, that kind of produce those kind of results.
Later on, exactly.
I kind of wonder about your craft. A lot of people here wonder about how people put books together and how they say what they want to say. In other words, there's sometimes you might want John Brown or a character or something to be out there, and so you have this kind of selection process. You can use a letter, you can use someone else commenting on it. I kind of wonder about how you assemble that, how you kind of make those choices and assemble your books. You know, your craft, your selection process.
I'm not sure I dignify my process with the word craft. I think I was sick the day in 3rd or 4th grade when they taught us to do outlines. I'm not someone who goes about putting together my books in a very organized fashion. For me, it's really kind of trial and error. I start writing while I'm reporting because I find writing helps me figure out what I've got, what I don't have, what works on the page. You can pile up mountains of research and then realize when you sit down to write it, you know, that just doesn't work on the page. So really for me, it's a process of diving in and finding a thread that does work and then just building from that rather than laying it out in advance, A, B, C, and D. It's really, okay, it's getting a little slow here, I need a little dialogue, or I need something a little more colorful. Enough of a history lesson here, time to get back to that, and okay, time to get back to some meat and potatoes. But there isn't it's not a very conscious process as I go along. It's more just by feel.
And that's good in a way because it's a tough balance because you can, you know, be worried about legitimizing the historical standpoint. Readers can feel like the thing is way too heavy. I've got it. I understand it. You've made the point. So maybe the kind of, if we use a kind of a hokey word, the organic side of things is something that maybe works well for you, right?
I think coming from a journalistic background, you're terrified of losing your reader. You know, you only have so many words, and you're competing with the sports page or the funnies or whatever else people might read. And so you really want to hook the reader and then hold them. And so I try and do the same with books. I'm very conscious of, well, what does the reader need at this point? Or is the reader going to get bored here? Or is the reader going to be confused? Do I need to step back and give more information? So, and I'm an impatient reader myself. So pace is very important to me. If it's not a good read, no matter how good the information is, they're never going to get to it if they just give up because they're bored.
some of the best historical works are produced by journalists. You know, the writing of somebody like Shelby Foote or Wilbur Cash, or I mean, really, all these. There's such a group of people who've actually kind of led that. And we were talking in our department we're saying journalists. You know, it's just something they've just got. We're jealous of the journalistic. I don't know, edge to the whole thing in general.
Part of it too is I don't think you're less likely to be sort of precious about your writing as a journalist. I mean, I didn't go to a writing school, and you're used to writing on deadline and editors kind of looking over your shoulder. So you kind of have a more of a workaday attitude towards writing. You know, I just got to sit down and crank this out, and you know, it doesn't have to be too fancy. Just, you know, get it on the page and see if it works rather than waiting until your aura is in the right place or whatever.
The 3 a.m. moment or something like that. Yeah, right.
No,
right.
It's like bricklaying. Yeah.
Yeah, morning time too. I think you're saying somewhere, I read an article where you're saying you're kind of morning, kids on the bus, straight to that. And I think some people that I've talked to and interviewed before, that's really kind of what it is. It's like morning time. If I want to get in touch with them, it's not going to be in the morning because it's kind of like
if you don't get
locked down.
Get stuck in the morning. And again, I think a lot of people have a sort of romantic image of writing, and the reality is it's like most other jobs. It's getting your butt in the seat and getting to work, and even if you really don't feel like it.
Do you think you probably been asked this a lot, I'm sure. Do you think you have a particular style? Or you're thinking, some people think, and maybe you've said that, maybe this latest book is a little bit deviation from a style, but do you feel like you've got a style that you could?
Yeah, again, style sounds a bit grand, and I certainly didn't sort of consciously develop one. When I started writing books, again, coming to it from journalism, it seemed natural to sort of report and go out and not just work in the archives when I'm writing about history, but to go to the places where history happened and weave between past and present, and also draw myself into the story as sort of your tour guide.
Yeah.
So I guess it's this mix of personal and a bit of travel, journalism, and history. This most recent book, Midnight Rising, though, is much more traditional historical narrative. I'm not in there, or very briefly. And so that's, is a departure for me, this one.
Well, you can feel like you're there. I can feel it in the beginning, the way you open up, you kind of lay it out. And I think with the maps and stuff, I can almost imagine you kind of scoping the place out and moving around it. And I think that definitely seeps through. So I think you shouldn't deny that this style is still in the other one.
You're always there as the author. And also I did still travel to the places I was writing about and tried to get a lot of on-the-ground color in Harper's Ferry and Kansas and other places. One, I have the luxury of being able to do that. I don't have a teaching load. I don't have department meetings. I have my publisher's advance to spend. So I have the freedom maybe to do what professional historians can't.
It's nice.
Yeah.
And what about your college education? You went to Brown and you were a history major. So, you know, of course, that makes us all interested. So what do you remember of Brown? Who did you study with particularly? How did that feed your historical sort of?
Yeah, I was always interested in history, but actually in high school and actually for most of college, I was probably just as interested in English and comparative literature. But I had really special professors at Brown, not necessarily in areas that particularly drew me. It was more I chose on the basis of the professor who kind of turned me on in the classroom. Brown, and maybe you do it here, had a sort of shopping period where you could spend the first few weeks sitting in on lots of classes before you had to commit. So ones that I remember was, I mean, this was a long time ago, so none of them are at Brown anymore, regrettably. Anthony Mulhall, who taught Italian Renaissance, Philip Benedict, who taught Reformation history, something I wouldn't have thought would interest me, but it was great. Well, Gordon Wood, who is still there as an emeritus professor, colonial America and Revolution. And then a man named John Dittmer, who was a visiting professor, who really turned me on to study of the South. He was a civil rights scholar from Mississippi. And I think he really stirred my interest, particularly in the South and in African-American history.
And that kind of got that kind of bug going.
Yeah.
So there you're moving toward, you're taking these balanced sort of courses, you're getting towards the end of you're going to graduate, you have to do something, and you're not going PhD history, you're thinking Columbia journalism.
No, it was a real accident. It was this Professor Dittmer who was my thesis advisor, And when I handed in my paper, because I thought maybe I did want to go on and study history at the graduate level and teach. And after reading my last paper, he said, I think maybe you should get out in the world for a while, which I think was a diplomatic way of saying, I'm not sure this suits you. I think he knew me better than I knew myself, that I was kind of too restless. I did want to get out in the world. And he had been teaching in Mississippi before that and told me about a union that was starting in Mississippi to work with pulpwood haulers, who were timber workers. It was sort of modeled on the farm workers in California. And I thought, sounds like an adventure, went down there, got hired, and spent a couple of years working as a union organizer. I was terrible at the job, but I was in such culture shock being this sort of East Coast urban kid in rural Mississippi that I found myself writing every night when I would come home from work about the strange people and places I'd encountered. And that's really what got me into writing. I wrote a piece for a local paper. I then made a documentary about my experience there, and on the basis of that, ended up at Columbia Journalism School. So I kind of backed into it, to tell you the truth.
Maybe that's a good thing. Sometimes it's good to back into this.
Well, seen a little more of the world maybe than I would have otherwise.
Yeah, and came back in with an edge, I think, on top of that.
So, and then when I got to journalism school, found that it really did suit me, and also fell in love with an Australian, now my wife, or has been for 28 years, and she sort of carried me off around the globe. So no, I didn't, certainly didn't follow a path that I anticipated when I was in college.
Thanks. That's really intriguing. I hope that we got some new insight out of your path to the situation you're in now. We're going to take a little break.
Sure.
And come back and I'll ask you a couple more questions, all right?
Great.
As president of Green Sun Energy Services, I implement solar energy programs that maximize the long-term energy production for each of my clients. I took the NABCEP registered photovoltaic systems program at Brookdale. I really love knowing that the solutions that we're implementing today, they provide clean energy to our clients, it saves them money, and it also eliminates about 5,000 pounds of carbon dioxide pollution from the environment every year. I have 20 years of business and management experience. What I needed was a better understanding of the most current solar energy technologies, the codes, and the regulations. I would recommend Brookdale to anyone who's considering entering the green jobs market. They provided us with real live scenarios that we would have to deal with in the field. My name is Glenn Coding, president of Green Sun Energy Services, and I got my start through Brookdale's short-term, non-credit training program.
To learn more on how to get your start at Brookdale, visit brookdalecc.edu/training.
Packers,
Vikings,
Red State, Blue State.
we come from different places.
Uptown.
But when we live united, we create real lasting change in the education, income, and health of our country. Real change won't happen without you. So give, advocate, volunteer, live united. Sign up at liveunited.org.
Hi, we're back again with Tony Horwitz talking about his new book, Midnight Rising, and getting some more questions about the book in specifics and how it came together and the character John Brown, which is such a fascinating study. And there's been a lot out about him, and Tony dug a lot into him and kind of let him come alive in a way. I read somewhere in the book that you said you wanted to get out of John Brown's way. You wanted to get out of the character's way and let him become him. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot written about John Brown, and I guess one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was I was frustrated in the books I read that he just drives people crackers. I mean, even really famous historians, C. Van Woodward, or famous writers, Robert Penn Warren wrote the worst book of his career about John Brown because he just, he's a very polarizing figure. And you get to the end of these books and you feel like the author either wanted to be, sort of charging into Harper's Ferry with Brown or fitting the noose around his neck. There was kind of like no middle ground. And I just really wanted to try and not come into it with any preconceptions, any axe to grind, any sort of statement to make, and just see what am I going to find if I just lose myself in this story for a few years and put it out there as clearly and sort of impartially as I could. So maybe in that sense I wanted to not get out of Brown's way, but get out of the way of all the myth and heat around him. I mean, it's hard to do because he is a hot figure.
He used a lot of his letters, a lot of writing, especially with I love the underlinings, keeping those kind of elements in there. It really helps a lot. And do you think it was that? Do you think it was the letters, the comments by the people? How do you think you began to get the best picture of him, do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, anyone who deals with this topic is really very fortunate because Brown and most of the people associated with him left a long paper trail. They're very literate people, and people saved their letters. And so I think that more than anything gives you some personal insight into Brown. He's very frank in his letters. He's very plain spoken. He doesn't write flowery Victorian prose. Almost all his letters are a page. He gets to the point. He says what he's thinking. He has a kind of a plain eloquence, a little bit of Abraham Lincoln in there. He's not a well-educated man, but he just has a kind of power and a leanness to his writing that I think reflects the man. So yeah, I would say his letters more than anything are what gave me insight, and also the letters of his family.
And the people that even opposed him and didn't like him and hated him, despised him, even in meeting him, kind of felt that was that line of integrity was there. That even though, boy, they wanted to choke him, you know, he was who he said he was. And so you could see that maybe the letters would have this truthfulness to them that some other letters, you might have. The guy he was, I've read things about him and kind of known about him, but boy, I really, from your book, I got a sense that this guy was like a machine. He was like unstoppable. I mean, the sicknesses he went through, the things he endured are just amazing. And, and he moved around. I wrote my notes that he, if he might have had frequent flyer miles. The guy crisscrossed the Northeast like crazy. I mean, did you found that kind of
Well, I think it's striking because we talk today about sort of future shock in our lives, and we think we've lived through such dramatic change, and we have in terms of communications. But you look at Brown's life, he's born in 1800. At age 5, he moves by ox cart from, Connecticut to Ohio. He's really born into a pre-industrial world when everything's moving at foot speed or horse speed or ship speed. And by middle age, he's crisscrossing the country by rail. He's sending telegraphs, instantaneous communication. He's sitting for photographs. The change that Americans experienced in that era was really remarkable. So I think some of his transience is about that. But he was also just a deeply restless, peripatetic man. He couldn't kind of stick to the one thing or the one place for very long. So you're right. If he had gotten, if they'd given frequent flyer miles in those days, he would have had a lot of free trips to Asia.
Right?
Yeah,
Daniel Boone was the same kind of. Daniel Boone was a kind of a restless guy. A couple years here, people always commiserate, about his wife sitting there waiting for the next return. And maybe there's a little bit of that restlessness. Maybe it's a little bit more of the period of time when people thought they could pick up and go. And I'll be back in 3 years. No cell phone calls. I think it was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, he's a very American figure that way. You do get a sense of a very restless time that first half of the 19th century.
And I think you said he kind of reinvented himself. You admired that, and he embraced the kind of the technology and ability to do that. He began to see the possibilities for what he was doing. I thought that was impressive about him too, that he began to utilize and knew that if he said something here, that would happen a little bit down. He would have made a great politician in some sense.
Well, it's interesting because he's a terrible businessman, but he's very savvy about the media in particular. He does recognize the power of these new instruments, the telegraph and the newspapers and the wire services, and he really plays the press. And so he is very, very clever about sort of public relations.
We need to kind of think about putting him in this sort of company of other people who we might call activists, and activists are one that physically do things. So I was thinking about, the Daniel Shays story and Nathaniel Bacon and Nat Turner. I don't know if I want to stick Timothy McVeigh, but I probably have to put him in the same area. But people who believe that, that the government and the conditions have only allowed me to do so much, and I need to take that extra step over the boundary. And since we're both history major people, we kind of did kind of classic Thomas Jefferson, George Washington story, where Thomas Jefferson celebrates the activism of Daniel Shays, who fought in the Revolution and felt like the people in Massachusetts were getting the way short end of the stick, and Washington, who blows his stack and says, you absolutely cannot do it. You can go burn British ships and throw tea overboard, but no going to munitions and helping yourself. And so, what do you think? Is he typical? Is he drawn off of them?
Yeah, he reflects again a very American strain, this tension between individual rights and society. And Brown, one of the things that struck me is really how much he identified with the revolutionary generation. Both his grandfathers fought in the Revolution, and he really thinks he's fulfilling the American Revolution. And perhaps what Jefferson said about the Tree of Liberty needing to be watered from time to time with blood. He sees what he's doing as really truly American. But it does set a very troubling precedent. I'm most interested in the people who have embraced him since. You mentioned Timothy McVeigh. On both the extreme right and the extreme left. Anarchists in the late 19th century modeled themselves on Brown. Weathermen and Black Panthers in the 1960s. And then in more recent decades, anti-abortion bombers, and Timothy McVeigh talked about him. So, you have this interesting mix. It's hard to pigeonhole him as right or left. He, again, reflects this strong strain in the American character.
And he's embraced, by people like the quieter types, by Thoreau and Emerson. It's hard. I really I got another look at Thoreau. I really am kind of a Thoreau fan, if you want to call it that. And I was really looked at Thoreau, and I was like, wow, he really bites into it. He's really that kind of violence is a-okay, and he's willing to celebrate it. And he has to kind of talk Emerson kind of into that, And then Thoreau's civil disobedience is sitting in a jail a little bit. He's not.
He's a pacifist.
Yeah, he's a pacifist. Yeah. So I mean, for him to say that that's okay, to me that's interesting that Brown kind of got to him and got to those people. You can see the reputation building and the legend and the story. He becomes this sort of like symbol for so many people, but that he pulled so many people along with him in that kind of place he went into, I thought I was really fascinating.
Yeah, well, I think Thoreau and Emerson and others had to do some intellectual contortions because they really were essentially pacifists, but Brown spoke to that individualism in transcendentalism and the individual conscience and following your own drum. And I think what it really speaks to more than anything, though, was the rage that was building up in anti-slavery Northerners, people like Thoreau, through the 1850s, what they saw as a series of insults by what they called the slave power. So I think you sense this rage building, and Brown really taps into that. At one point, Thoreau writes in his diary, my thoughts are murdered to the state. This is after the Kansas-Nebraska Act and then a fugitive slave being dragged south from Boston. So I think he spoke to that smoldering side in the North.
And that language, that time frame, 55, 56, that 5-6 years leading up to it, people are tossing around the word blood like it was like a common everyday blood, murder, and it becomes the common language. You can really, the book really helps to really see that. You can really see that this is really beginning to get to that point. People are using verbiage they never would have used before. I mean, it's almost, you can almost go back to revolutionary sort of language, the revolutionary lingo, independency, and you can have the threats and you can almost see the physicalness in the American Revolution stuff. And you can see Brown using that. You can see the whole country, so in some ways you kind of show that he wasn't alone. He's not, using that kind of language is something that people fell into. And, and you get people saying these kind of things. Well, that's just it. The Jefferson Davis, well, that's it. Or,
Jefferson Davis, he says, we will sever the ties that bind us even if it rushes us into a sea of blood. I mean, he's standing up and saying this in front of the Senate. So you're right, the rhetoric was extremely violent. And I think, again, reflected this kindling that's piling up around the nation, and Brown just kind of puts a match to it at Harper's Ferry.
And they seem to kind of want it to come. They kind of almost like it's like this massive event and cataclysmic. Now we know huge numbers, maybe 750,000 people died. But they seem to want to draw it. They seem to kind of want it. And I was I use a quote from John Quincy Adams, in the Amistad case, he's in front of the Supreme Court, and he says, well, if it means a civil war, then, just let it come, And like you just said, let's have a civil war. Right. And I think that's interesting, that they were really thinking that they were, and maybe that's how far gone it was. So Brown's maybe not so far out there. It's just he's just kind of giving you
speaking to something that's out there. On the other hand, I think when they were talking about civil war and what they imagined as an apocalyptic struggle, I don't think they imagined the scale of the Civil War. I mean, you know, in the Revolution, the combat deaths are about 4,500. War of 1812, it's half that. Mexican War, I mean, I don't think they had any notion of a conflict that would claim, you know, 620,000 lives. So, you know, they thought the other side would cave quickly. So I think you're right. There was that naivete, really, and not unlike World War I, same kind of thing. It got very bloodthirsty, and then it starts, and then people realize what they've gotten themselves into.
Tony, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being here, and thanks for listening.
Great.